As you'll see, the bookshelves behind me are empty, and that's because I've packed up all my books and I'm about to leave New York later today after a 4 month spell here teaching at Glucksman Ireland House at New York University. It's been a great joy to do this assignment, to deliver this course to students at New York University. I've had an excellent group of students that I've really enjoyed teaching and mentoring the best I can. And the course has dealt with Ireland between 1880 and 1940, but looking at our history using the literature of the period, the great writers, Yeats, Joyce, O'Casey, Synge, as windows into the Ireland of that time and ways of understanding the history of Ireland during those crucial years. So I'm just here going to give a brief summary of some of the conclusions I've drawn from teaching this course and from discussions with the students and with others at New York University. And the first thing I would say is that I chose 1880 as a starting point for this course, and I did so knowingly because I take the view that that year was the year in which Charles Stewart Parnell became the leader of the Irish Party at Westminster, taking over from Isaac Butt. But it represented a kind of a transitional period for Irish nationalism, because with Parnell and his allies, all of whom were Irishmen born either during or after the Great Famine, so they were the first proper post-famine generation. And they seem to have had a different mentality and a more aggressive approach to the work of their parliamentary work as nationalists representing Irish constituencies at Westminster. So you had people like Parnell, John Redmond, who succeeded him eventually in 1900. You had John Dillon, who succeeded Redmond when Redmond died in 1918. You had William O'Brien, you had Tim Healy, you had a whole range of people, all of whom were born in the 1840s and 1850s mainly, and they came into Parliament in the 1870s and 1880s, and in many cases continued in Parliament until the Irish Party was defeated in the election of 1918. So they were a very powerful generation, and what Parnell and his party did was they broadened the scope of parliamentary nationalism. They engaged with Irish American Fenians and brought them on board to some degree, at least with funding some of the activities of the parliamentary party. They allied with the land reformers, with Michael Davitt and people like that, who were running the Land League and seeking to bring about change in the ownership of land in rural Ireland. And although the parliamentary nationalists are seen to have ended up on the wrong side of history after 1916, you have to look at the achievements that they recorded during the 30 years, the 40 years after 1880 and until the end of the party's control of Irish politics in 1918. You had the reform of local government in 1899, which resulted in a transfer of power in local authorities from largely unionist hands to nationalist hands. So all of the local authorities after 1899 were controlled by the Irish nationalist interest, and therefore they ousted some of the more established figures who had represented more middle class and business community, and indeed the Anglo-Irish community too. Then you had the Wyndham Land Act of the early 20th century, which began the process seriously of transferring ownership of the land of Ireland from the landlords that had controlled it for centuries to their tenants. So the social revolution in Ireland occurred before the political revolution took off in 1916. And then, of course, they did, in fact, manage to deliver Home Rule in 1912 to 1914, but they were unfortunate in that while Home Rule was acceptable and in fact was greeted enthusiastically in Ireland in 1914, by the time the war came to an end, everything had changed utterly, as W.B. Yeats memorably put it in Easter 1916. So that's the reason why I started the course in 1880. But what I try to do is to look at the various movements that helped to transform Ireland during that time, starting with cultural nationalism, the cultural nationalism of Michael Cusack, who founded the GAA, the cultural nationalism of Douglas Hyde, who helped to found the Gaelic League in 1893, and indeed the cultural nationalism of W.B. Yeats, who argued strongly and powerfully and brilliantly in many ways for the idea of a national literature for Ireland written in the English language. I suppose a question arises as to whether this cultural nationalism had the kind of influence on Irish history that W.B. Yeats claimed when he gave his great speech in Stockholm in 1923 when receiving the Nobel Prize for Literature. He claimed that after the fall of Parnell, cultural movements had assumed centre stage and that they had produced a long gestation and a stir of thought that had led ultimately to the Anglo-Irish War and Irish independence in 1922, or at least the independence of the Irish Free State. Of course, Ireland was partitioned, which was a great tragedy, especially for those who found themselves north of the border that was established in 1921-22, particularly for the nationalist community that suffered afterwards through discrimination that really wasn't properly monitored from London. Northern Ireland became a sort of majoritarian state with all the consequences that had. But moving away from that, back to the subject of cultural nationalism, a lot of historians would say, well, no, these cultural nationalists were just sort of, people who generated some interesting ideas. They created a bit of enthusiasm for all things Irish in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But ultimately, it was the the Fenian element, the Tom Clarks and the Sean McDermotts who orchestrated the rising and who took over the Irish Volunteers from within after the Volunteers were established, and especially after the Volunteers split in 1914, when the majority went and supported Redmond in his call for Irish people to fight on the battlefields of the Western Front in order to vindicate the cause of Home Rule. The Fenians obviously didn't do that, but they ended up being influential in the rump of the Volunteers that remained behind in Ireland, and they were the ones who carried out the Easter Rising of 1916. So my view is that in fact, cultural nationalism was an important part of the backdrop to the Easter Rising. You look at the fact that, let's take three of the more prominent figures in the 1916 Rising. Patrick Pearse, Thomas MacDonagh, both executed as signatories of the proclamation of 1916, and Eamon de Valera, who commanded one of the garrisons, one of the groups that took over buildings in Dublin during Easter week of 1916. And all of those were attracted into political life or nationalist activity through their membership initially of the Gaelic League. So the Gaelic League did generate quite a lot of passionate support for the idea of Ireland's distinctiveness as a country. And when you look at the way in which Yeats talked up the Irish past, the way Douglas Hyde idealised the Gaelic tradition, the way in which Michael Cusack and the GAA generated such enthusiasm for distinctive Gaelic games, it seems hardly possible to imagine that people who'd taken on board those ideas would have been satisfied with a subordinate political position being ruled from London. So you have to ask yourself, what drove people like De Valera to take part in a rebellion that could well have lost him his life when he was just making his way in the world with a good career and a young family? So cultural nationalism seems to me constructed an image of Ireland that was so distinctive that it could not be reconciled with a subordinate, an inferior political position vis-a-vis London. So the Irish identity that was constructed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was formed of various strands, the Gaelic League, the GAA, the Literary Revival. But they all told the same story about Ireland, the story of a heroic, fabled heroic past which could be recovered to fuel a glorious future for an independent Ireland. So And that, of course, is what happened between 1916 and 1922, when these young idealists of the generation after Parnell and his allies took over the nationalist movement, radicalized it, and then created this revolutionary moment which delivered independence in the form of the Irish Free State in 1922. And then, of course, that state became highly conservative because there was this reversion, if you like, to a conservative brand of nationalism, which you wouldn't have suspected if you were looking at the nationalist tradition between 1960 and 1921. But in the 1920s, the realities, the pragmatic challenges of having to run an independent state meant that the conservative instincts of those who took over as the government of the Irish Free State asserted themselves. The Catholic Church became more powerful, and a rather narrower version of nationalism prevailed, one that alienated people like Yeats and George Russell and others, who found this New Ireland to be a disappointment to the compared with the ideals that they had generated during the period of the cultural revival. But that sort of failure of revolutions to fulfill their loftiest ambitions is a pretty common phenomenon, not certainly restricted to Ireland. So let me look at the writers that we've been dealing with over the last 14 weeks. First of all, W.B. Yeats, great colossus, involved in every Irish movement, really, commenting on everything that happened in Ireland between the 1880s and the 1930s. And in his final poem, or one of his last poems, Under Ben Bulben, Ancient Ireland Knew It All. And he talks about the need to recall our indomitable Irishry, to adhere to our indomitable Irishry. So to the very end, he was committed to his version of the kind of Ireland that he strove to create. So his initial phase in the 1880s and 90s was this idea of a romantic Ireland, which could have both a popular literature that would also be of a high artistic standard, that it would be patriotic and would have literary value at the same time. That was a difficult combination to pull off, and frankly, it didn't manage to achieve it. And you have the peak of Yeats's nationalist enthusiasm really was at the turn of the century, between 1898, when he was involved in the centenary commemoration of the rebellion of 1798, and then, of course, he was involved in opposing the Boer War, which a lot of advanced nationalists opposed, which was a very unpopular thing to do when it came to British opinion, which was quite gung-ho when it came to the Boer War, and the Boer War generated great patriotism in Britain, but in Ireland it generated the opposite effect of a lot of Irish people sympathising with the Boer cause, including W.B. Yeats. And then, of course, in 1902, he produced this great nationalist play, not a great play, by the way, but certainly a great nationalist play, Kathleen Ni Houlihan, probably the most nationalistic piece of writing that Yeats ever produced, and he did that in combination with his great friend and confidant, Lady Augusta Gregory. And then, of course, he founded the Abbey Theatre in 1904. But already at that time, privately, he's starting to express some doubts about the direction of the Irish nationalist tradition. And as the first decade of the 20th century wears on, Yeats becomes more and more alienated by developments. For example, the negative reaction to the plays or to the play by the Western World, John Millington Synge's masterpiece, that Yeats really regarded very highly, had a very high opinion of, and that was caused disturbances and criticism of Synge and his play, both in the Abbey Theatre and also in the nationalist press. And then you had the controversy over the funding and creation of a municipal gallery to host the pictures that Hugh Lane, Lady Gregory's nephew, had donated to the people of Dublin. And Yeats got very heavily involved in that, and there was a lot of pushback from people in Dublin who didn't believe that was a priority at that time for Dublin to build a new municipal gallery. So by 1913, Yeats is writing Romantic Ireland's Dead and Gone, It's With O'Leary in the Grave. And then along comes the Easter Rising, and Yeats is inspired by the Rising. He's ambivalent about it, of course, but he's also inspired, and he sees that it is a terrible beauty. In other words, that it has this terrible element of death and destruction, but it also has the beautiful idealism that motivated the leaders. And I think that description of the Rising is actually a very powerful one. But also Yeats, in the immediate aftermath of the Rising, understood that all had changed utterly, and that a terrible beauty had been born. And then, of course, in the years that followed, he wrote poems about the War of Independence. His poem 1919, he wrote about the Civil War in Meditations of Time of Civil War. The Second Coming, of course, is influenced partly by the backdrop of events in Ireland, but also partly by events in the wider world, where he wrote that things fall apart, the centre cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, and everywhere the blood-dimmed tide is loosed, the ceremony of innocence is drowned, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. So he has become a great public poet, and I take the view that his writing benefited from his engagement with Ireland, and that Ireland also benefited by having a poetic record as powerful as Yeats's that throws light on that period of Irish history when independence for the Irish Free State was finally delivered, against the odds and with great difficulty, it has to be said. And then, of course, in the 1920s, he embraces the Anglo-Irish tradition and is very critical of Irish nationalism and so forth, and then recovers, if you like, his enthusiasm towards the end when he talks about under Benbob, and that ancient Ireland knew it all. So Yeats's journey is a fascinating one, and I think the engagement with Ireland really helped to toughen up his poetry and make it the kind of modern poetry that it is now valued as. I mean, had Yeats died in 1900, he would have been a minor poet who'd written some brilliant poems like Lake Olivinish Free and When You Were Old and the Song of Wandering Aengus. But it is really the poems he wrote in the 20th century, most of them anchored in his engagement with Irish affairs, that really, I think, establish him as a major poet of the 20th century. James Joyce's case is quite different. Joyce left Ireland in 1904. Joyce was really somebody who probably left Ireland because of the way in which he saw nationalist Ireland developing. He wrote in a portrait of the artist as a young man about wanting to leave Ireland, to escape the nets that would hold the artist back from soaring into the stratosphere. And those nets were the nets of language, nationality, and religion. And of course, Joyce was much closer to the coalface of nationalist Ireland, that he was part of that community that was embracing these ideas, and it didn't appeal to Joyce at all. Had Parnell delivered Home Rule in the 1890s, for example, Joyce's father could well have been a significant figure in a Parnell-run Home Rule Ireland, and perhaps Joyce would never have felt the need to go abroad at all, because maybe those nets of nationality, language, and religion wouldn't have been so threatening to him at that in those circumstances. But Joyce did go abroad, and in fact, we owe his exile to we owe the great novel Ulysses, which is probably the best depiction of Ireland in literature, to the fact that Joyce left Ireland and then could observe the Ireland he left behind with a forensic eye and a brilliant pen, and that's why Ulysses is such a remarkable history novel in my view, and I've argued that strongly. In particular, the Cyclops episode, which really delves into cultural nationalism and the Irish Ireland traditions of the early 20th century, that really annoyed Yeats and probably also helped to drive Joyce out of Ireland, because of a perception of a narrowing of the nationalist tradition at that time, which alienated Yeats and encouraged James Joyce to leave the country altogether. So Joyce really is someone who wrote about Ireland that was on the cusp of dramatic political change. That change happened 10 years later, or more than 10 years later, after Joyce's departure from Ireland. But we get from Joyce a really, really detailed portrait of the fading world of the Parnellites, his father's generation, who had been dramatically disappointed by the failure of Parnell to stay the course, and then Parnell's fall from grace and his ultimate early death in 1891. In the case of Sean O'Casey, we have a different story again, and I would say that Sean O'Casey was the first great revisionist, in that he was initially an enthusiastic member of the Gaelic League, of the GAA, was involved in Irish dancing, was involved in everything that happened. He was a member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the Fenian movement, and he was also a very devoted labour activist, a trade unionist, and was really the labour dimension to O'Casey's identity that really prevailed in the end, and that caused O'Casey to push back against the nationalist tradition that had lionized the heroics of the men of 1916, of the War of Independence, and had lionized the Civil War as well in many ways. So O'Casey basically said no to all of that, and he was, I suppose, the first historical revisionist who decided to turn his back on the traditional nationalist narrative about the history of that period. And what you get in O'Casey is a sympathy for the ordinary Dubliners who he saw as victims of a middle-class nationalism that sacrificed the interests of the working poor in Dublin, and they were the ones that galvanised O'Casey into writing his three great history plays, Plough the Stars, Shadow of a Gunman, and Juno the Paycock, that deal respectively with the Easter Rising, the War of Independence, and the Civil War. And without those events, O'Casey would never have been a great playwright, would never have written those poems, of course, because the events were required in order to inspire O'Casey into this wonderful explosion of dramatic creativity that occurred for O'Casey between 1922 and 1926 when he finished The Plough and the Stars. And then finally, I looked at the work of John Millington Synge and Daniel Corkery. In particular, Corkery was the intellectual component of the Irish Ireland movement, that he wrote this book called Synge and Anglo-Irish Literature in the early 1920s, and he excoriated the whole Anglo-Irish tradition, denied that there was anything that could be Irish about the Anglo-Irish tradition, saw these people who had written in English about Ireland as really being writing for an alien market, writing for a British market, responding to critical notions that were prevalent in Britain rather than being rooted and anchored in Ireland. But strangely enough, Corkery made one exception, which was John Millington Synge, because he appreciated that Synge had gone out to the west of Ireland, had lived with the people, and although Synge's work was unpopular with nationalists in the early years of the 20th century when the Playboy was the subject of demonstrations in the Abbey Theatre, you have Corkery 20 years later giving it a retrospective stamp of approval as a genuine Irish classic, which it is seen as to this very day. So that's a wrap. Thank you very much. That's a wrap on the course that I've been teaching here. All of these video summaries that I've recorded are all available on the Glucksman Ireland House YouTube channel. So if you've an interest in watching some of the other summaries that I've done, please access them there. And also, please support the work of Glucksman Ireland House, which for me is a premier location for Irish studies. I've been here now 4 months, and I haven't come across any program anywhere else outside of Ireland that deals with the agenda of Irish studies in the comprehensive and impressive way that is done at Glucksman Ireland House. Thank you very much for your attention and for watching these videos. Slán agus Beannacht.